Good afternoon. Welcome to this virtual lecture event from the King's College in New York City, where I serve as provost. My name is Mark Hidgley, and today we're delighted to welcome to our lecture series a senior fellow of the King's College, Tim Goeglein. Mr. Goeglein, in addition to being a senior fellow at King's, was formerly a top aide to President George W. Bush, and he is currently the vice president of External Relations at Focus on the Family. Mr. Goeglein is going to address us today on the topic of faith and the public square, the fate and state of religious liberty in America today. And after he brings his remarks, we'll have a time of Q&A. We will be putting up a phone number in the chat box where you will be able to text your questions to Professor Goeglein. So without any further ado, welcome to Professor Goeglein for his lecture, Faith and the Public Square, the Fate and State of Religious Liberty in America Today.
Dr. Hidgley, thank you so much. It is truly the honor of a lifetime to be associated with the most important institution of higher learning in New York City. There is so much buzz about NYU, about Columbia, about Fordham, etc. But I have had both a formal and an informal association with the King's College that now is going on 25 years. This is a remarkable institution of higher learning. It gets better and better with every single semester. And I really love and I'm honored to serve as a senior fellow at the King's College. And, when we chose this topic of religious liberty several months ago, we could not have really envisioned the direct, and I might even say dangerous assault on our religious liberty and conscience rights, perhaps as never before in the United States. And I would like to take a step back, if I may, just in setting the purview for part of my remarks this afternoon. I was in a debate about 3 weeks ago, and it was a rather lively, wonderful debate in which my interlocutor asserted that increasingly there was, she said, religious America, and she said there was non-religious America. She said overwhelmingly, or she asserted rather overwhelmingly, that religious America is declining, she asserted, and that non-religious America is actually increasing. And immediately, but not for debaters' points or trying to be clever, I said to her, in fact, I felt that America, and I was, again, not being clever, at least I pray not, that America was actually as much or more religious than it had ever been, even from its founding. She looked at me with a bit of a frown, and she said, "What survey or poll bears that out?" And I said to her that it had nothing to do with polls or surveys. It had to do with a lifelong study on my part on the nature, in air quotation marks, of religion. And I asserted to her and to the audience that particular day that secular progressive ideology, in fact, is a very powerful religion, that it is not agnosticism, it is not atheism, but secular progressive ideology. My friend Robbie George at Princeton has so eloquently said, and I could not agree more, is in the ascendant in all of our elite institutions, and in fact in our society. Taking a step back and to be very clear about this, I believe, in other words, that never before in the history of our still young country have we ever had two major, broadly speaking, worldviews really battling one another. One side is the historic Judaic Christian tradition, which I might add is a very potent and a very affirmative presence in the public square. But I would argue that over against not nothing, but over against another religion, this kind of secular progressivism I'm talking about, means that we have arrived in 21st century America at a new norm and a new reality. And the biggest part of that new reality is that this religion, this secular progressive ideology now, is like a cavalcade through all of our elite institutions in American society, going back to Robbie George's public discourse views on this. He says that you can find this kind of religion everywhere in the federal government, here in Washington, D.C., where I have lived and worked for more than 35 years, many state governments, universities, news and entertainment media, the arts, all the professions, professional associations, labor unions, charitable foundations, major business corporations, and on and on. In fact, I think rightfully, Robbie quotes the New York Times columnist David Brooks, who says that this gives the woke a kind of monopoly or near monopoly on cultural power in the United States. In other words, when we, in my view, discuss this idea of the fate and state of religious liberty and the rights of conscience in 21st century America, I believe that we make a rather gigantic mistake if we look merely to the historic Christian and Judaic traditions over against something that does not have the flavor or the power, I might even say the theology of an authentic religion. I believe that that's how we should actually view secular progressivism. It is the major thing that American Christians in the 21st century are up against. And obviously, this enables, as Robbie says, the transmission of woke ideology. And I want to be very clear about this because Robbie, in a wonderful essay, has said that it is, which is secular progressivism, a fundamentalist and increasingly militant pseudo religion to rising generations. This is their religion, and it makes it difficult for anybody who chooses to dissent from that regnant or dominant new religion. And I think he is decidedly correct. Whether it's in New York, here in Washington, or anywhere in this vast, complex continental nation. What we are up against as dissenters from this dominant view is the challenge of our lifetimes as Bible-believing Christians. And I would argue it is the greatest challenge to the rising generation of King's College students, supporters, and alums, even as never before, because this ideology has its own ecosystem. And it's very clear that if you choose not to participate overtly or covertly in this new pseudo religion, you will be punished. And those who foist and practice this new pseudo religion are very clear about the ramifications for those who choose not to go along. And I think that Robbie is right. I think to survive without being subjected to discrimination and even cancellation is one of or two of the immediate results of this impact of a new religion in America. Now, I want to be more proactive for just a moment, because for those of us who do challenge it, as Robbie has said, whether in the name of natural law and natural rights, or from other perspectives. He says that we are fighting what amounts to an intellectual guerrilla war against an extremely powerful and deeply entrenched adversary. And I think that Robbie is exactly right. In other words, this is an intellectual war, a war of ideas at a very high order. It's a war for the hearts and minds of people all across our nation and the world. And it doesn't make it any easier to know that it has the full force and power of almost every single elite institution in our country. One would expect a certain, I guess, amount of pessimism in these circumstances, as Robbie has said. But I must say that I am an incorrigible hopefulist because I believe that discouragement and despair is a sin. And I believe with Robbie that hope is a virtue and that we should all have at it. Despair, as Robbie has said, is a sin against the Holy Ghost. So hope moves us to act, trusting in God much more than in our own poor abilities and efforts, even when we find ourselves up against very, very difficult odds. I must say that I am a student, of American history and a worldview that knows that rights always come, and always is a big word, but that rights always come with responsibilities. And those who are incapable of enjoying freedoms will inevitably lose them. Those unable to govern themselves will have to be governed. And so, to be clear, this is not a statement of what ought to happen. It's a statement of what always happens when a culture morally breaks down. The choice for any people, as the late great writer Chuck Colson often said, is between the conscience and the constable, which is to say, if a people will not be governed by conscience, they will in fact be governed by the constable. The loss of conscience, which is always a failure of moral formation, will lead ultimately to the loss of freedom. I want to go back to the founding for just a moment, because I believe that America's founding is more relevant, more timely, more topical to this discussion of the fate and state of our religious liberty and freedom in 21st century America, more, I think, than ever. Our second president, John Adams, famously said that the Constitution was meant for a moral and a religious people. And he said it is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. His observation applies as much to the time that we are living in, I would argue, as it did to 18th century America when John Adams was living. And the shocking lack of conscience on display in many parts of our beloved country today, I think is producing behaviors that can largely be grouped into one of two categories. First, we are seeing historic levels of suicide, opioid use, and overdoses, as well as epidemic levels of loneliness and isolation, especially among the most vulnerable populations in our country. And together, these are collectively known by among sociologists who measure these things as deaths from despair. And very often, not categorically, but very often they are attributed directly to the loss of faith, the loss of hope, the loss of a tangible religion. And in a country, culture, and civilization that very often does not uphold the value and the standard and the importance of faith and religion across all institutions, you have an organic outcome that naturally leaves millions of Americans without hope and behind. And I might add that secondly, you have the various and consistent acts that we see as we see them here in Washington with a choice of policy and personnel, as if faith and religion have no role to play in the public square whatsoever. Just in the last few weeks, we have seen here in Washington a numerous number of legislation and personnel choices which are directly in opposition to our worldview, to our religious liberty and conscience rights. One of the most profound is called the Equality Act. I want to raise my right hand, if I may. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, I have lived and worked here in Washington for 35 years. I worked for a little over a decade in the United States Senate, nearly 8 years at the White House for George W. Bush, and a little more than 13 years for Focus on the Family in Washington, D.C. And in all of that time, I have never read, or if I may say, been shocked more by the frontal assault, the direct frontal assault on religious liberty and conscience rights as embodied in the Equality Act, which was first introduced in the House of Representatives, where we have already had a vote. The largest question now is when and whether it will come for a vote in the Senate. But without going into the specifics, there are numerous parts of this bill which directly say to men and women of faith that as long as you keep your religion and your faith within the privacy of your home or within your house of worship, you'll be fine. But if you bring your religion or your faith to bear in the public square in any number of ways, you are ipso facto excluded from American public life. And in fact, there are all kinds of levers built into the Equality Act to make sure that people of faith who actually act upon their faith or their religion in the workplace, in their communities, in neighborhoods, they will organically be punished. It's remarkable to actually be reading a bill drafted in the House of Representatives that has been drafted specifically to negate our conscience rights. Surely that is one of the first things that someone notices about such a bill. Another bill is called simply H.R. 1, which means House Resolution 1. It's a profound nationalization of our elections in a country where elections are supposed to be run at the local, state, and regional levels. And embedded within this very dangerous piece of legislation are all kind of levers to keep people of faith and people who wish to practice their religion out of the election process. And I want to be very clear that this is not a partisan statement. This is not a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative statement. I'm being partisan not to the party, but partisan to the issue. And the issue is religious liberty. And if we were to nationalize our elections, which is to say, this bill puts Washington, D.C. in the driver's seat. And if we were to nationalize our elections, the vacuum at the local, state, and regional level, with direct ramifications for people of faith practicing that faith in the public square as it relates to how they vote, how they campaign, where they choose to campaign, whom they choose to speak with. All of these delineations are spelled out in what I believe to be one of the most dangerous pieces of legislation to come down the proverbial pike in a very long time. We have also had a number of personnel decisions in this new administration, which I think are particularly sobering. For instance, the person who will become the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, so-called HHS, which is the largest single domestic agency within the federal government. The person who will be overseeing HHS, its secretary, is a person who both in the House of Representatives and as a state elected official in California, specifically, overtly, regularly cracked down on people of faith, specifically along the lines of conscience rights. When this nominee was first coming to the Hill, I was quite certain, having followed his tenure both in his native state and in the House of Representatives, I was certain that this could not have been the case, but in fact it is, and he has been confirmed. And I have no doubt whatsoever that in the weeks and months ahead, we are going to find immediate places where there will be a direct clash between the policies that are being pursued at HHS and people like us, people who believe in a robust living out of our faith in the public square, and that we find no contradiction being Americans and people of faith with the clear ability to speak out and to act out on our faith, even regarding a host of domestic policy issues. And as I say, I think in the relative short term, we're going to find out precisely what this is going to mean. In any administration, Republican or Democrat, personnel is policy. And it's the policies that flow from the personnel, and it is the worldview that forms the ideas of the personnel. And I'm going back to where I began. This kind of woke, progressive secularism is the religion that is too often and predictably often powering where we are going, both in the federal government and in many of our state governments as well. And I want to go, if I may, on a sidebar for just a moment, because after his visit to America, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a very famous French aristocrat who came to the United States in the 1830s, and he is widely considered the most important observer of early America, the ways that we thought about things, the way that we did things, why as a people we were motivated to do things in the way that we did. His brilliant Democracy in America is a must read for everybody connected with the King's College. So after his visit to America in the 1830s, Tocqueville famously described the role that religion and local community groups played in uniting and directing our nation. And if Tocqueville were writing today, almost 200 years later, I think he'd instead describe, a society very unlike the one in manifest ways that he observed at the time. Because in Democracy in America, he makes very clear that religion and faith is the fulcrum of the motivating factor at the community, local, state, and federal level. That he said it was impossible to understand America from America's faith. That the building of our governing structures, that the very foundation of the way that we organized our neighborhoods, our communities, our entire way of life, Tocqueville said, was rooted in the idea of Christianity. He said that you would not really be able to understand the United States of America if you did not understand the action-oriented application of the Christian faith in the public square. And I think Tocqueville was exactly right. I mean, I think, self-evidently that was the case. And I think for many of us, we continue, to be very comfortable with a large role for faith and public life robustly practiced in 21st century America. And all of this came to mind, I think over the course of the last year, as any number of states began to crack down on houses of worship who, even in limited numbers, wanted to meet for worship on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, even in states where the winnowing of the percentage of people relative to an entire congregation, or the typical number of people who were worshiping in a parish, a synagogue, or a mosque on a particular day or weekend, even in those instances where they were willing to really keep those numbers small, the predictability at which too many governors were willing to fully restrict the ability to gather for worship was really shocking. And the fact that in any number of these instances, that there was a willful punishment of people of faith, I think is the reason that several of these cases came directly to the Supreme Court. In Tocqueville's day, this would have been truly unthinkable, that you would have had to have prosecuted a case all the way to the Supreme Court so that a very small percentage of the people of a particular parish or congregation could meet to worship God at least once a week. And yet, over and over again, the Supreme Court were kept as busy as bumblebees with these predictable number of cases that came to them. And I think it's fair to say that the fate and state of religious liberty and conscience rights took a genuine beating over the course of the last year. Not because in many instances, the Supreme Court gave what I believe to be a constitutional green light for the houses of worship to meet, but in several instances, there were justices who have historically favored religious and conscience rights who in fact went the other way. I am reminded over and over again that the father of our Constitution was James Madison. And of all the things that Madison, who was truly brilliant, of all the things that Madison wrote, one of my all-time favorite quotes from him, and I am quoting from Madison, is that conscience is the most sacred of all property. Conscience is the most sacred of all property. This is precisely what Tocqueville was observing. This is precisely what our founding fathers and mothers wanted for America and saw for America for religious liberty and conscience rights all the way going forward. They sunk this into the Constitution. I'm reminded that neither John Adams nor Thomas Jefferson were at the Constitutional Convention, two of our most important founders. Jefferson, of course, was our first ambassador to Paris. Adams, our first ambassador to London. Both of them from very different parts of the ideological spectrum. Jefferson from Virginia, Adams from Massachusetts. One a congregational Yankee from the North, and one, a very wealthy member of the Virginia aristocracy. They differed on absolutely major things, but they agreed categorically that they would not and could not support the final affirmation of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights that placed our religious liberty and conscience rights first among equals. And in fact, our First Amendment has never, ever been under greater assault, or more important than now, in light of these two massive worldviews that are clashing in America. I must say, I think it is a providential blessing of God Himself that the King's College is located exactly where it is located. I believe that God has purposely placed the King's College in New York City at this very moment because the fulcrum of these two clashing worldviews are found each and every day somewhere in New York City. You drive around your extraordinary city. You go through all five boroughs, and one of the things that you are taken with immediately is the large number of churches. Yes, there's beautiful skyscrapers. Yes, there's beautiful buildings of all kinds. But in each and every one of the boroughs, from Staten Island to Manhattan, it's incredible how often you see churches of every kind. Protestant, Catholic, storefront churches. I mean, it's impossible to understand, New York City, even now, without the reality of faith and religion. It's not a coincidence that all of those churches then and now are placed there. It's consistent with who we are as Americans. And yet, at this very moment, every one of our elite institutions are using their full firepower in opposition to the continuation of our religious liberty and conscience rights. I want to mention this because I think this is very important. Of the last 15 major religious liberty issues to have come to the Supreme Court, with only one exception that I can think of, religious liberty has prevailed. I mean, I think that that is absolutely terrific. Praise God for that. But when you think of the gigantic number of cases that never make their way to the Supreme Court and never will, you realize that at the local, state, and regional level, we are witnessing our brothers and sisters in Christ and men and women who are also of faith, but perhaps not of our Christian faith, who are really bearing an ahistorical burden for their religious liberty, in the public square. I think that this has become the battle of our time. I would argue that politics is downstream from culture. Culture leads, and the fulcrum of culture is the spiritual nature of a country. And I believe it is probable that the fissure and the divisions within politics reflect the fissures and divisions within culture, which arise from a kind of spiritual crisis that has beset the United States of America in the 21st century. And I believe that we are part of history, and we at the King's College will be part of sorting out whether our country will remain religiously free, where our consciences will remain unbound, or whether we will be dragooned essentially into giving up our religious rights and conscience rights, for some other negotiated end. And I believe for that reason that we have never been called upon more than now to be well aware of these remarkably strong forces who are working and pushing against the very fundamental ineluctable rights that institutions like the King's College were actually built upon. Because what happens over time is that culture creates a kind of centrifugal force that can push against ministry and church affiliated institutions in ways that those institutions have not previously even thought of. And so I think that this question of the fate and state of our religious liberty is as acute and as important in the public square as it has ever been. I also want to make one other point, if I may. America has become, to borrow words from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's 1978 speech at Harvard, a place with, and I'm quoting Solzhenitsyn, little defense against the abyss of human decadence, such as the misuse of liberty for moral violence against young people, such as motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror. Solzhenitsyn believed that even stricter laws, would be powerless to defend a people against moral corrosion. And I think at the end of the day, this is the practical result of what I'm describing in the arts, in the humanities, in elite legal culture, in academia, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we are witnessing a moral corrosiveness that only religious liberty and faith can actually face, because there are not enough laws that can be passed, in any manner, to prevent this kind of trajectory that I think that we have all witnessed and felt over and over again. And if the devolution of our collective conscience continues, the replacement of constitutional rights with the kind of constables, that Chuck Colson spoke of, that I mentioned a moment ago, might seem to be inevitable to some people. But I believe very strongly, and I believe this with all of my heart, that just as individuals can have very difficult times in their lives, that countries and cultures can have difficult times in their lives as well. And I believe right now our beloved country is going through a demonstrably difficult time. It's sorting out whether it wants to continue this kind of religious faith arc that has guided it so well from the beginning, or whether it wants to go in a different direction altogether. And I believe faithfully that there are millions and millions and millions of people who share the bedrock views of the King's College and focus on the family and all of our great allies, many of them Christians, many not, but they realize the efficacy and the value and the utility of the spiritual sense. And I believe that the spiritual sense has served our remarkable country very, very well over all of these years. And I believe that we are primed for an American restoration, for a time of renewal and a time of regeneration. And I believe that it doesn't necessarily need to be the majority of people who would lead this kind of restoration or regeneration, but I think it does take a very concerted remnant. And I believe that the King's College is comprised of the best of America. I believe the great King's College is in fact a remnant of the rising generation of young Christians who understand the value and utility and goodness of faith in public life. That when you have a country that is robustly religious, when you have a country that welcomes conscience rights into the public square, that in fact it's not only good for Americans, for Christians, but it is good for all Americans. That's what I believe very strongly. And so I believe that the King's College has a very special role to play in this still young, new generation. And I am an inveterate hopefulist, and I believe that there is a very tall task ahead of us. But I believe that we will be successful by God's grace. Prayer availeth much. And I believe that Providence has been extraordinarily great to the United States of America. He has guided us, led us, and directed us at other very difficult times in our nation's history. He has led us successfully through two terrible world wars, through one terrible civil war, through a terrible depression, through a moral and social revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And so when it's very tempting to be discouraged or despairing, I believe, in fact, that just when you think you're at the end of it, just when you think you've come to the proverbial end of your rope, I believe that it is darkest, just before the dawn. And I think we have an enormous amount of work to do. We have a country, a culture, and a civilization to save. And I believe that it's not going to be saved by Washington, D.C., or Wall Street, or Silicon Valley. It's going to be revitalized and restored and regenerated by a robust Christianity that is fully confident, acting in the public square, and that is replenishing all of our institutions in the arts and in the humanities, in elite legal and public policy circles, of course, in the ministry, in the state bureaucracies. I think that the King's College really embodies the way forward for religion and faith rights. It's all contested ground, and there's a lot of work to do. But I believe the way forward actually can be bright, especially if we are willing collectively, to understand just what a late hour this is for all that we hold most dear. So, at the expense of sermonizing or lecturing or being Solomonic, I'm very happy, Dr. Hidgley, to close my remarks there and to happily and eagerly and earnestly answer or duck a few questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Goeglein, for your remarks this morning. It's been really good to hear your thoughts about sort of where this moment may reside in the history of the country and its founding. I want to start with a question. Well, first of all, let me remind our viewers that they can text their questions to 646-355-8946. 646-355-8946, and that number is in the chat box. So, Professor, if I'll take the privilege of asking you the first question. It's kind of a big one.
Sure,
But it's this, I've always been fascinated by the American experiment where we're a country of laws, but we're also a country where our laws kind of come out of a consensus. It's a consensus of representative government, not popular democracy, but nevertheless, it's a consensus. And we're also a pluralistic nation, and we always have been. And so I wonder if you could, you alluded to some of this towards the end of your talk. I wonder if you could say something about both the challenge and the opportunity of that in the context of religious freedom.
Yeah, I'm really actually pleased, Dr. Hidgley, to have you ask that question right off the top. Because, we have a gigantic battle ahead of us in the area of the contest of ideas and the need to persuade. And I have found, and I'm sure you have too, that too often, especially among we evangelical Christians, that we find our comfort zone in the proverbial holy huddle, and we only occasionally otherwise get out to make our case. And I in this debate I mentioned to you earlier in my talk, someone had said in the Q&A section, how difficult it must be to be a conservative and a Christian with focus on the family, living and working in Washington, D.C. for all of these years. And I said, and in fact, it's one of the great blessings of my life, because, if I were choosing to live in a place that was much more commodious and where I was surrounded by a majority of people, who mostly agreed with me, I wouldn't really have to refine or to cultivate the ability to develop good arguments. As the late great senator from from your state. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, and I love it, he said, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not everyone's entitled to his own facts. And I find, and I'm sure you do as well, Dr. Hidgley, and in your great vocation there, that as Christians, if we are to win the argument, we have to engage in the kind of thing that sometimes makes us most uncomfortable. We have to refine our ideas. We have to build relationships with people who may see the world entirely different than we do. And then we have to spend a lot of time listening and absorbing their views and their ideas, earning credibility with them to be heard. And I have found, and I know you have too, because we've discussed this, that over time, when you build what I call trans-ideological friendships, which is to say, friendships not rooted just in somebody who agrees with me, but very often people who don't agree with me at all. When I get to know them as people, I then have a portal to be able to attempt to persuade and to bring them along to our view. And I think in one sense, that has been some of the power of American pluralism, that we don't have to get up every morning in America with the hope and goal that everybody will agree with us. What we do have to get up, with the hope of each day, is that we will have the ability to be able, with civility, magnanimity, and good grace, to be able to have a kind of ongoing dialogue and conversation to fully and freely express from our conscience why it is we believe what we believe. And it is in those moments of sharing those kind of grace notes of the power of religious liberty and conscience rights that people who otherwise organically may not agree with us come to see, he's got a point or she's got a point, that we don't have to agree on every major issue, but that it's good for everybody when we fully invest everybody with the right of conscience. And I think that this was I might say, genius or the kernel of genius in America's founding. Dr. Hidgley, we often think that the founders were all of one piece, that Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, that they all agreed on all the major issues. Nothing could be further from the truth. They disagreed categorically on the biggest things there were. And I'm not taking any license here. That very small core of the principal founders disagreed enormously on questions of religion. But they came to see that giving a broad swath of conscience rights was nourishing to a constitutional republic. That if you wanted more freedom and more liberty over there over a long period of time, that you had to find a way to nourish virtue, moral excellence. And they found that in the American experience, moral excellence was nourished by religious liberty and the right of conscience. And I think that this is a testament to the work of the King's College, precisely where you're at in New York. You are actually the embodiment of virtue in a city and in a state that has never been more hungry for moral excellence as a feeder and as a nourisher of freedom and liberty. I believe that very strongly.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that very much. And we're grateful for your kind words about the college. Let me throw out something that we say around here and get your reaction to it in the light of your thoughts and remarks. We like to say that we're interested in not in teaching our students what to think, but in how to think. And yes. So could you say something about that in relationship to religious liberty and the other topics you've raised?
Well, I find that incredibly refreshing, especially in light of what is happening in so much of campus culture now nationwide. I have a very good friend who has just written a major essay in national affairs, and he essentially diagnoses cancel culture, wokeism, and its impact in the higher learning. How it is, a kind of malignancy on the historic greatness of higher education. This is part of what makes King's College so unique and so refreshing, because as times have changed and fads have changed and styles have changed, your principal mission, the exploration of ideas, has not changed. This is part of the fundamental greatness of the King's College and its timeless mission. There are, I think it goes without saying, untold numbers of young Christians who are intellectually gifted, who want to be a part of several of the most elite colleges and universities in the country. They have the intellectual bandwidth to do so. They can, score wonderful grades and do a good job. But overwhelmingly, when the lights are off, when the cameras are off, when they're being candid, they're very want to say that increasingly they feel that their consciences are bound, that their religious liberty is restricted, that they can speak about any topic. But if they dare speak about their Christian worldview, if they dare speak about the centrality of Jesus Christ in their life, if they speak about the importance of the application of the Bible to a good life, if they talk about a biblical worldview, if they have the kind of normative conversations that take place in large numbers at the King's College every day, they find that in much of contemporary cancel culture and wokeism, that in fact they are no longer able to be free. I'm going to extend this just a little bit, if I may, because there are two novels that I know the titles of which are mostly conversant to most alums of the King's College: 1984 and Brave New World. 1984 by George Orwell, essentially a distillation of tyranny. Orwell was a liberal, but he understood in his time the terrible toxicity of Soviet communism on conscience. And of course, Brave New World, a novel which is also dystopian, but has less to do about government crackdown and more about the elevation of laughing or amusing ourselves to death, the pleasure principle. And I think what we find, Dr. Hidgley, in 21st century America, as it relates to college campuses, and specifically with the underpinning of religious liberty and conscience rights, is that these two very big ideas, both in Brave New World and in 1984, are resulting in the ministry of truth, the memory hold, the erasure of culture, the erasure of history, the erasure of theology, the erasure of the Bible as a central foundational principle of the United States of America and of higher education. We are really down this very long road, and it would seem to be a late hour for much of American higher education. So these are deep waters of a major magnitude.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on that. We have time for one more, I think, and I want to throw this out because I know it's a topic of great interest to our constituency and I think across the country right now, especially when situated again in this context of freedom of expression and religious liberty. And that is you alluded to the importance of social connection as to success in
Yes.
in the work of the country. And so my question is, what do you think about social media in this context as a social issue and an issue of expression and relationship? And what do we need to think about that in this very important time?
I'm again very pleased to have you ask this. I think the ramifications are so enormous that we will be internalizing this for over 100 years. I want to use one example of endless numbers of examples. Most of us who are in the baby boom generation, and I was born the last year of the baby boom, 1964, we were raised to be horrified by the idea of book burning. Some of the students at King's will know the great novel Fahrenheit 451, the great story Fahrenheit 451 by Bradbury. The idea of the burning of books and so forth, the burning of physical books. But here we are living in a time where some books, even books that are bestsellers in the New York Times and others, are considered worthy of essentially, in air quotation marks, being burned on social media, removed simply from availability because they deal with narratives or themes that are not broadly, in air quotation marks, acceptable to some in elite culture. Again, I'm going back one step. Those are very deep waters. Where do you end? Are there themes in certain books of the Bible that are no longer considered, acceptable to be sold or to be read in the public square? The ability to meet in person, the ability to express ideas, the ability to consider ideas, the ability to read them. I mean, these are very concerning topics, and we're only at the beginning of it. I think that the COVID era has shown us both the value and utility of things like Zoom and GoToMeetings and Google and all of the really remarkable possibilities for social media. I praise God for it often. In the era of COVID, even today, this is a really a wonderful alternative. But at the same time, the idea of being canceled, the idea of being ostracized, the ability of having a career ruined or reputation ruined. These are very real things. And very unfortunately, social media is too often used as a truncheon to conscience. And that kind of truncheon to conscience and religious liberty in the public square is a very definitive, large part of the kind of discussion that we are prompting today.